Thank you, Ginger, for filling in. Worship was definitely less hairy this morning. Nothing wrong with hairiness, but it was less. Let's open our Bibles to Romans chapter 4, and I've been told to keep it quick. So I will try my best to do so. We do have our potluck after service today, so we'll get to it. Romans chapter 4, from verse 1 to verse 12. I will read, and you can follow along, and we'll pray towards the end and ask God for his blessings on our meal as well. Starting from verse 1. What then shall we say that Abraham our father has found according to the flesh? For if Abraham was justified by works, he has something to boast about, but not before God. For what does the scripture say? Abraham believed God, and it was accounted to him for righteousness. Now to him who works, the wages are not counted as grace, but debt. But to him who does not work, but believes on him who justifies the ungodly, his faith is accounted for righteousness, just as David also describes the blessedness of the man to whom God imputes righteousness apart from works. Blessed are those whose lawless deeds are forgiven and whose sins are covered. Blessed is the man whom the Lord shall not impute sin. Does this blessedness then come upon the circumcised only, or upon the uncircumcised also? For we say that faith was accounted to Abraham for righteousness. How then was it accounted? While he was circumcised or uncircumcised? While circumcised, but while uncircumcised. Not while circumcised, but while uncircumcised. Verse 11, and he received the sign of circumcision, a seal of the righteousness of the faith which he had while still uncircumcised, that he might be the father of all those who believe, though they are uncircumcised, that righteousness might be imputed to them also, and the father of circumcision to those who not only are of the circumcision, but who also walk in the steps of the faith which our father Abraham had while still uncircumcised. So Paul mentioned at the end of the section that we covered last week, he actually posed a question and answered his own question. He is just previewing doubts and questions that might arise by those who were originally reading this letter, this treaty of faith, if you will. And on verse 31 of the previous chapter, chapter 3, he mentions here, do we then make void the law through faith? Certainly not. On the contrary, we establish the law. Basically, what he is posing here is this potential question, essentially saying, okay, if we are justified by faith, if our righteousness comes through faith, then does that make the law nothing? Does that make the law useless? Does that void the law? And he answers that question. He says, no, certainly not. What God does is actually through our faith, but mostly by his gracious deeds, he confirms the law. And now, after this affirmation, he is going to illustrate his point. He's going to confirm his point, starting from chapter 4, but it will actually go all the way through chapter 6 and on. Every once in a while, he's going to come back to this idea that faith does not nullify the usefulness of the law. So here he starts off by utilizing one of the main figures in Jewish history. If you think of the Jewish people and them having a Mount Rushmore of sorts, you would have in that mountain most likely Moses, definitely Abraham, and David. You could add a fourth one there, but those were the three top guys in their history. These were the people who were most esteemed. So here he's actually going to utilize all three of these individuals. Moses actually indirectly, he's not going to talk specifically about Moses, but he is going to utilize Moses' writings. So either directly or indirectly, he's utilizing these three individuals who are very much esteemed in their history, who had to do with the law. And again, he's utilizing them for the purpose of proving that the law is still useful even though righteousness comes through faith. Now, if we read again the first three verses of chapter 4, once again it says, "What then shall we say that Abraham our father has found according to the flesh? For if Abraham was justified by works, he had something to boast about, but not before God. For what does the scripture say? Abraham believed God, and it was accounted to him for righteousness." So Paul is making it very clear here that the righteousness that was achieved by Abraham, it was not a righteousness achieved through the works of the law. It was actually a righteousness that was decreed or imputed upon him. Through the faith that he had in God's promise, God accounted that belief, accounted that faith for righteousness. Now, what did Abraham have faith about? In general, God, but specifically in God's promises. On chapter 15 of Genesis, God approached Abraham and told him, "Abraham, look upon the heavens. What do you see? Do you see all of these stars? If you were able to count them, there would be many. So will your descendants." Now, Abraham had no reason to believe God as of yet because his wife was barren. He didn't have any children. They were all getting up there in age. But it's stated there, Moses writing about Abraham states that he believed. And because he believed, that was accounted to him, that was attributed to him as righteousness. So again, we're making this idea very clear. Paul is making this idea very clear. Abraham's righteousness was not achieved through works. It was achieved through faith. And also, going back to a previous point that we made, it's not that God just all of a sudden, poof, made Abraham perfectly, morally righteous. Abraham was a good dude. He was a good moral person. Still rough around the edges, not perfect whatsoever. But then God did not make him perfectly morally righteous. He was positionally righteous. He was right before God because God decreed it. Not because necessarily all of a sudden, magically, Abraham changed from one second to the other. Now, Paul goes on to continue to prove his point and build his argument. So from verse 4 to verse 5, he essentially makes a point about debt and the fact that God is not debtor. He is debtor to no one. Look what it says from verse 4 to verse 5. "Now to him who works, the wages are not counted as grace, but debt. But to him who does not work, but believes on him who justifies the ungodly, his faith is counted or accounted for righteousness." Essentially, the point being made here is that when a person fulfills his portion of an agreement, of a contract, if you will, his earnings, that is not by grace. It is deserved. He has fulfilled his obligations according to a particular contract, according to a particular agreement. Whatever he gains, whatever he attains, he has earned. So the other party is a debtor because he has fulfilled his obligations. It's essentially how it works when you are employed by an employer. When you fulfill your hours of work throughout the day, throughout the week, usually it's every couple of weeks, you get that paycheck in the mail. Nowadays, it's direct deposit. What happens when you see that coming into your bank account? Do you rush to Hallmark? No one does that regardless. But let's say if you did that in the past, you grab a thank you card, right? Those with little animals, a cat thanking a dog for something, I don't know. And beautiful card, beautiful thank you message, and you start writing because you are so thankful that your boss has submitted, has sent out your, is that what you do? Have you ever done that in your life? No. Why? Because the check was earned. You worked for it and you received that which was yours. If you did not receive that, he would be at fault. He is obligated to do so. And this is what Paul is saying here. If righteousness, if salvation, if justification came from the works of the law, that which you received from God would be a debt that he would be paying. And God is debtor to no one, which is why it's not based on the works of the law. It's not based on earning anything. It's not based on effort. It is by grace through faith. And then he goes on to utilize another one of these very prominent figures in their history. Again, think of this Mount Rushmore idea. He's already talked about Abraham. He's going to go back to Abraham later on. He has utilized the writings of Moses again in Genesis, and now he's going to talk about David and how David understood this phenomenon regarding faith, regarding imputed justification or righteousness. So here he is actually quoting a Davidic psalm, Psalm 32. So from verse 6 it says here, just as David also describes the blessedness of the man to whom God imputes righteousness apart from works. Blessed are those whose lawless deeds are forgiven and whose sins are covered. Blessed is the man to whom the Lord shall not impute sin. So here Paul is actually looking at the other side of the coin. Until now, his argument was basically about righteousness not being made available through good works. In other words, if you think that you can achieve righteousness through good works, through good deeds, through obedience to the law or any other moral code for that matter, you are wrong. But there's another side to this coin, because a person or people can make a similar argument but sort of the inverse. They can say, well, maybe it's not through good deeds, but it's because I did not do anything bad. Do you see how that's kind of the same argument, but the other side of the coin? Kids do that all the time. They want a treat, they want a favor, they want something, and you ask, why do you deserve that? Well, I didn't do anything bad recently. Isn't that worthy of a treat? No. You're just doing your job. So here he is touching upon this faulty idea. It's sort of the opposite. It's the other side of the coin. And he is utilizing David because David was very aware of what it felt like to be guilty of sin. Not only to be guilty of sin, but receiving forgiveness even though one did not deserve it. Now, David, he is described in the Bible as a man after God's own heart. But does that mean that he was perfect? We know that David was not perfect. Does that mean that he was sinless? No, we are aware of David's sins. There's a few of them. Probably the biggest one, the ones that caused more heartache, was when he committed adultery with Bathsheba. And because of that and other stages of his life that he felt, that he understood that he was guilty of sin, but then eventually received forgiveness even though he did not deserve it, he wrote several psalms. And they're sometimes called psalms of penitence. In other words, he was considering this idea of his sin and sin in general, and what that means towards others, what that means towards God, and what it means to receive forgiveness even though one is in this state of ungodliness. So he writes about it. He writes about what it means to receive this forgiveness even though one does not deserve it. And on verse 7 and on verse 8, again, this is a quotation from Psalm 32, he actually covers three aspects of this forgiveness. He says, "Blessed are those whose lawless deeds are forgiven." In other words, those who are guilty of offending God by breaking the law. Blessed are those who are forgiven despite this offense. And then he goes on to say, and whose sins are covered. Now this idea I want to spend some time on, because the fact that a sin is covered, that's not novel. That's not counterintuitive, because we do that all the time, don't we? When we see the filthiness of our own sin, what is usually the first thing that we do after the fact? We try to cover it. I remember an incident in my own household. It happens very often. And we have several rules, regulations, laws, if you will. I put them in a tablet and but verbally speaking, everybody knows the rules. And one of the rules that has been a staple in the Silva household is markers do not enter my house. I learned that very early when my wife started bearing children, that markers and children and walls do not mix. You can do the crayons, you can do the colored pencils, you can do the chalks, but I do not want markers in my household. So I never buy markers. And every once in a while, when the kids receive markers, whether it's at school or some type of gift or whatever, I investigate and I get them and I literally throw them away or give them away. No pity, no remorse, no ill feelings. They know the rules. But every once in a while, being sinful beings that they are, one in particular, I won't say who that one child is, but decided to keep a marker. And then playing with the marker, drawing with the marker. And at that particular time, we had carpet, a relatively light carpet. And that marker ended up on the carpet. And it stayed there for a little while, and it started bleeding and bleeding. And then you had a beige carpet with a dark brown spot. Well, that child obviously tries to fix the issue. And what happens when you usually try to fix an issue? You make it worse. So there's some rubbing, some scrubbing, and it got worse. Well, what's the next best thing? I can't go back in time. I try to fix it. It's not fixable. What do? I cover it up. And I kid you not, I did not see that stain for a month. Every once in a while, I would go in the room, and there would be a toy in that particular spot. And I'm like, okay, there are many toys everywhere, so that's just one of them. And then there would be pants, and then a hat, and then a pillow. And I kid you not, for a month, that blemish was covered. But inevitably, it can't go on forever. And I don't know how, but eventually I found out. What is this? What happened? Well, a month ago, I'm like, what? A month ago? If you would have told me right away, I could have bought some type of product to try to, but a month? There's no way that this is going to be fixed. It's already ingrained into the fabric of this carpet. All of that to say, the covering up of one's sin, that is not novel, that is not new, that is actually expected. What is counterintuitive here is the fact that the offended party is the one covering up the filthiness of the sin. And David is saying, blessed is he who has that done unto him. The filthiness of my own sin is being covered up by the offended party. And then he goes on. I said threefold, right? So the first is just this forgiveness of someone who has sinned against the law, whose lawlessness or lawless deeds are forgiven. And then whose sins are covered. And then verse 8, blessed is the man to whom the Lord shall not impute sin. Now this is actually kind of strange just based on the wording here. Because we have here somebody who is guilty, but sin is not accredited to this guilt. That's the gist of what is being said here. Guilty. Guilty. No doubt about it. But sin is not accredited to this guilt. Why? Another would carry the weight for this sin. Another would have to deal with the repercussions of this sin. Even though I am guilty, even though I did wrong, even though I am the one to blame, guilt is not accredited to me. Another will pay the price for that sin. And David is saying, blessed. Blessed is he. It is the other side of the coin. It's not only the fact that by doing good, I don't get righteousness. It's also by not doing good or not doing bad things, I should say. Righteousness does not come through that. Not doing bad things is not a way to attain righteousness, because inevitably we are guilty. We do bad things. Yet God, he favors us. God, by his grace, he forgives us and he cleanses us of those sins. And then he goes on. So as Paul is continuing to develop his argument, now he is thinking about another potential question that might arise. Basically, he is thinking about the fact that people knew who Abraham was, the Jews. That Abraham was their forefather. And then one may argue, well, regardless of how Abraham achieved his righteousness, you say it is because of his faith. I think it is because he fulfilled the requirements of the law because of the covenant. Regardless of that, fact of the matter is, God made a covenant with Abraham. And that covenant had to do with blessings upon his children. And that covenant was ratified through circumcision. Now, if Abraham, who had this covenant with God, ratified through circumcision, if he was made righteous, so am I if I have the seal of approval, namely, if I am circumcised. If Abraham was righteous, then I am righteous because I am a child of Abraham. How do you know that I'm a child of Abraham? I've been circumcised. And that is a ratification of the Abrahamic covenant. I am covered. The counter argument to that is based on timeline. Because Paul basically says here, look, chapter 15 of Genesis covers this imputed righteousness of Abraham. You'd have to go all the way to chapter 17 to see when this covenant was ratified through circumcision. 10 to 15, I think technically 14 years later, did Abraham receive this seal of approval, if you will, because of circumcision. So technically, his righteousness came prior to circumcision. Now, you're right by saying that Abraham is somewhat of a father figure to your faith. Even right by saying that you are covered if you have this affiliation to him. But technically, circumcision is not what brings you affiliation to Abraham and consequently the righteousness that he achieved. It is faith. So regardless if you are circumcised or not circumcised, you are a child of Abraham if you walk by faith like he walked by faith. So that's the gist of this remaining part. Does this blessedness then come upon the circumcised only or upon the uncircumcised also? For we say that faith was accounted to Abraham for righteousness. How then was it accounted? While he was circumcised or uncircumcised? Not while circumcised, but while uncircumcised. And he received the sign of circumcision, a seal of righteousness of the faith which he had while uncircumcised, that he might be the father of all those who believe, though they are uncircumcised, that righteousness might be imputed to them also. And the father of circumcision to those who not only are of the circumcision, but who also walk in the steps of the faith which our father Abraham had while still uncircumcised. I don't think I've ever said circumcision or uncircumcision more in my life. But this is the point that Paul is trying to make. Affiliation to Abraham is important. But you do not prove your affiliation to Abraham through circumcisions or works of the law. You prove that you are a child of Abraham, that you are affiliated to him by faith or through faith, mimicking the faith that he displayed. So now going back to that original question that Paul proposed on chapter 3, verse 31. Again, he is trying to prove his point. What point is Paul trying to prove here? The question that he thought would arise was, well, if justification, if righteousness comes through faith, then the law is void. Then the law is needless, right? Then the law doesn't mean anything. The law is useless. No. What you actually see through the scheme that God has built, of achieving righteousness through faith is God respecting the law. Is God actually establishing the law, upholding the law? Why? If it was the opposite, God would just say, okay, no problem. Forget about it. You broke the law. You sinned against me and against my decrees. You did something bad. Forget about it. Don't worry about it. Let's move on with our lives. Won't ever think about it ever again. If God acted like that, then you could make the argument that God is making the law void. But God did not act in such manner. God respected the law so much that he would not allow sin to go unpunished. The price needed to be paid. And everything that Jesus had to go through, it was because God was establishing the law, was upholding the law, was respecting the law. He would not allow the law to be neglected. Somebody has to pay. Someone needs to pay the price. So he sent his son. And because he sent his son, that actually proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that he respected his law. Now, the issue is not whether or not the law is irrelevant. We know that the law is relevant. The issue is whether or not we make God's choice to uphold the law through his son's deeds. The relevance of that. And oftentimes, in very practical ways, we make that divine choice irrelevant. And the equation, simply put, goes more or less like this. The more we make ourselves relevant, the less Jesus is relevant. Think about it for a second. The times of our lives that we become the focal point, that which is relevant, those are usually the time when Jesus becomes less relevant. Yet the opposite is also true. When we, through faith, understand what God did on our behalf, trust in what he has done and will continue to do, regardless of our own will, regardless of our own preferences, regardless of what we may like or dislike, we make ourselves irrelevant. But consequently, this divine choice becomes relevant in our lives. It's not through us, it is through our faith in him. Amen.